Good afternoon, and welcome to week 5 or module 5. What's going to happen in 5? Well, a whole pile of different things are going to happen, and I'm not going to use the usual sort of PowerPoint slide just to outline them. Rather, I'd like to walk you through a couple bits and pieces of the week so you know what's coming your way. Here we go. You're going to have 4 major events. First off, you're going to be kicking off part 2 of the plan. So let me grab a marker here. Okay, I'm going to choose this color, whatever color this is, and you're going to be kicking off part 2 of the plan. Okay, so far you've been working on part 1, the big visionary sort of stuff for your design, the big ideas, the stuff you want to dig into, the hypotheses, the research questions, that sort of stuff. Now you're going to move into part 2 where you start thinking about the nuts and bolts of how you're actually going to do it. Okay, so welcome to part 2. You're also going to be focusing on something called operationalization if you're quantitative, or construction or constructs if you're qualitative. Operationalization is just a fancy way of saying this. This is how we define our variables. Done. Okay. Why do we use operationalization? Well, job security. As academics, we need to come up with fancy terms to keep the rest of the world thinking, oh, we need to be employed. No, but seriously, it's actually just a technical term for defining variables. Why? It's been around for a very long time and it's stuck. So there it is. Constructs. Constructs are the things that allow us to capture the ethereal uh, observations, the intangible observations usually associated with interviews and interacting with other people. We'll talk about a little bit about that as well. We'll go through an example of each. Don't worry about it. You're also going to be formatting a table, hopefully, and trying to think about, or a figure, maybe both, depending on what you do, and trying to figure out how to work them into your study. Okay. And if you need a link on how to format and think about tables, check out this link here. Okay. Well worth it. It's also in the attachment below the video. Then you're also going to do the Peregrine assessment. The Peregrine assessment is just a way for the school to gauge your academic prowess in business. And what's going to be really good is you go in, you're going to kick butt, you're going to do really, really well. You're going to get a decent score. You're going to say, wow, I've learned a lot so far. Is the exam easy? No. But is it fair? Yes. It'll give you a good sense of what you know about business before you're done with this class. So you're going to be doing the Peregrine assessment too. Now, you might be wondering, will this mess with my grade? No, I'll make sure it won't. Okay, so don't worry about that. Just go in there and excel. No penalty, no nothing. So let's get to it. Let's get to the stuff that people want to know. What is going on with this fancy word that is called operationalization? Okay, I'm going to use light blue to box it. Operationalization is just a fancy term of basically saying this is how we define our variables in a quantitative study. That's it. That's all that word means. Now, what you may want to do is you may want to look at this URL here. I'm going to draw an arrow. It's actually so important, I'm going to draw another arrow. And I'm actually going to draw a third arrow just to make the exaggerated point of you should go check this out. Why? Because it's a very straightforward and easy read about operationalization and how to do it. And believe it or not, we're going to be doing it in the green box below. So hang in there. But before you go into the green box, you should go check out that link. You're also going to realize that an operationalized variable has 3 pieces. It has an anatomy of sorts. Just like we have heads, arms, and legs and stuff, an operationalized variable has 3 things going for it. The first thing is, let me find my marker. Where is my marker? There it is. It has this. It has the name of the variable being measured. You have to give it a name, otherwise people won't know what you're talking about. Then after you name it, you have to describe exactly how you're going to measure it. And when I mean exactly, I mean exactly. Why? Because other people are going to look at this and say, okay, they measured, let's say, something like happiness. How did they measure it? They're going to read this part and go, ah, that's how they measured it. Or they're going to look at it and go, what did they measure? Now, the other benefit of B is kind of obvious. Um, there's 3. I lied. There's 3. There's 3 real benefits to part B. The first one is this: somebody else can take your variable and go use it in their study just like you did, which is pretty awesome. That's a hallmark of science. When it comes down to measurement, we should all measure roughly within reason the same way. The second thing is, once you know how you measure something, your study is a lot easier. It makes a lot more sense. You're sitting there like, I can finally understand what I'm doing now. This makes total sense. I got it. The other thing is that it really facilitates any discussion between you and your teacher or mentor. If you and your teacher or mentor are on the same page when it comes to measurement, your conversations are going to be much, 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 much better. So think about it. Threefold benefit for really clearly define your measure. And the last part, part C, or the third part, is how you interpret the results of this measure in context of your study or the problem that you want to dig into. Okay, let's go see a template and let's go see an example. But before you do that, you should pause the video and go read this link, because what will follow will make a lot more sense. So I'm going to assume that you're going to pause, you're going to come back, and here we go. We're going to scroll down. Okay. Everything we need is in this green box. So I'm going to choose a different color because I like a different color. Let's go with purple, I guess. Okay. Now, all we really do is we fill in the blanks, then we revise it for readability. I know readability is not a word, but I don't care. We open up with part A, the variable being measured. Okay, so we're going to name it right here. We give it a name, whatever its name is. Then we're going to explain what it measures here. Then afterwards, we're going to say the measurement is defined by, then we're going to have an exact discussion of how this thing is measured. However this variable is measured appears in this purple box here. This variable is interpreted as, and we'll come up with an understanding of what this variable means in context of the study and the problem I want to dig into. And you do this for all the variables in your study. So if you have 3 different variables that you want to operationalize, you're going to be using this template 3 times, once for each variable. Not so bad. Then down here, bottom part, is a justification. This is where you sit down and discuss with your audience or your reader or even yourself how these variables were chosen. And you usually want to fill in this blank in such a way that it appeals to your ability to tackle the problem and your framework or your worldview of the problem. Also, these variables were operationalized and chosen because, if you fill in this blank, they help you understand the problem, tackle your research questions, and perform hypothesis tests. By blending all of this together into a nice 1-paragraph argument, people, and you especially, will be convinced that you chose the right variables for the right reason. That's it. That's all operationalization is. So if you have 2 or 3 variables to operationalize, you'll be using this top paragraph 2 or 3 times. Then you're going to be using this bottom paragraph once to justify what you've done. How long is this section? It varies. I've seen it between 3/4 of a page up to 2 or 3 pages, depending how many variables you have. If you find yourself going beyond 2 pages, you might be going on too much, or if you have too many variables, this is when you'll start to notice that. um, but, uh, but if you have a lot of variables, you just may have to have a few more pages. So, I don't know what to tell you, but I'll give you feedback when it's time. And that's it. That's the template. So we're going to go over one example together below so you can kind of see it. I'm not going to do the justification part. I'm just going to do the operationalization part. Okay. And it's right here. I even give it as right here. Now, I'm going to measure something called attentiveness, which is, when you get down to it, something that's very difficult to measure. It's like, hey, how do you know someone's attentive or not? And to be perfectly honest, in grad school, it's kind of easy. When you look at a classroom full of students, there's always ones in the back there who are asleep. They're hanging off their chair, falling off the table, apologizing as they go, and wake up everybody. Then you have the attentive people in the front who are present, asking questions and stuff like that. However, it's really hard to assign a number to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a way to assign a number to attentiveness. And here it is. Attentiveness, that's the name, measures how alert a student appears during lectures. That's part A for our operationalization list above. Okay? Now we're going to get into how we're going to measure it. The measurement is defined using Zoom's attentiveness plugin and may range from 0, completely inattentive, to 10, completely attentive. So now everyone knows exactly how we're going to measure this thing. We're going to have Zoom use this plugin to record everybody what they're doing during the online discussion and crank out a number using its algorithm. What's really nice about this is it's absolutely certain. You know exactly what you're going to be doing. I know exactly what you're going to be doing. And anyone can do this. They can replicate what you're using. So cool. This is good. Then we have an interpretation of what this variable means. This variable is interpretative as a measure of how well the student engages in Zoom-based lectures, course discussions, and interactions with peers. There you go. And that's an operationalization. We have a variable called attentiveness. We know exactly how we're going to measure it using the plugin, and we know what it means within context of our study. Excellent. That's what we want. And that's operationalization. That is one operationalized variable. If you have 3, 4, 5, or 6 variables, you got to do this 3, 4, 5, or 6 times before cranking out the justification at the bottom. How does that sound? That's not so bad, right? Good. Now, let's move on from the realm of numbers, quantitative stuff, into the qualitative stuff. And to be perfectly honest, this is where it gets a little weird. Why? Because qualitative people do stuff like focus groups and surveys without numbers and interviews or content analysis or case studies, things that numbers really don't belong to. Okay? And if you can't measure with numbers, what do you measure with? It's like, hey, I need to measure how tall you are. Cool. Okay, but we can't use a ruler. Oh. Um, okay, we can just say you're taller than that person. Okay, or you're very tall. You get more descriptive. You get more ethereal. You get more intangible. Constructs allow you, with a little bit of luck, to take the intangibleness of something you see during an interview, for example, and attribute it to some sort of measurement, a count, an identification of it, something. For example, we're going to scroll down to this diagram, then work our way up to this paragraph up here. Let's say during an interview, somebody wanted to measure how happy the person was during the interview process. So we're going to start at the top of this diagram here. We have to measure happiness. How the heck do you measure happiness? I mean, it sounds nuts, okay? First off, it's not something you really assign a number to. It's like, how happy today are you? I am a 9. People will look at you kind of funny, and, you'll probably look at yourself kind of funny too. There's no computer probe we can stick into someone's head to measure their happiness because 1, it's illegal, 2, it would be way too much fun, and 3, the moment you stuck the probe into their head, they would no longer be happy. So it would be a very destructive measurement. And 4, it'd probably get us in jail. So let's not use probes, okay? So how do we measure happiness? Well, what we do is we define pictorially, then we write up a paragraph about it, what happiness is in context or as a construction of our study. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down happiness for an interview into 2 things, a verbal component and a nonverbal component. I am going to say during the interview process, I'm going to look for 2 families of happiness, 2 aspects of happiness, 2 dimensions of happiness. Let's use the word dimension because that's the proper term. I'm going to look for the verbal dimension, which has tone and content. If someone sounds enthusiastic, like, yeah, that's a sound of happiness. Or if they sound like, oh, God, this sucked. I wish I had fire his blood. You know those discussions. That's unhappy. Okay. So there are verbal cues when it comes to happiness, and it's usually related to the tone and content of what comes out of the person's mouth. Okay. We all know these conversations. There's also nonverbal cues of happiness. For example, if you see somebody with like jazz hands, you can see that they're excited. Their body movements are like, yeah, this is really cool. I'm looking into it. Their hands are flying around doing all sorts of cool things, making shapes in the air. Usually that's a sign of happiness or possibly, a little bit of anxiety. So there is a nonverbal cue that could show a positive type of happiness, if you want to call it that. Okay, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it happiness. There's also nonverbal cues that show the opposite of happiness, like stress, sadness. It's like when someone puts they put their face in their hands and they start sighing, or they start pulling on their hair. I've seen that in a few interviews where people just start stressing out and pulling on their hair. Or my personal favorite is I had someone talk about their previous boss and started flipping the boss off during the interview, even though the boss wasn't there. So there are certain nonverbal cues that give away the fact that the person ain't happy. Okay. So it makes sense to break up happiness into verbal and nonverbal components. Why not? It makes sense. Now we need to be a little more particular on what counts as verbal and what counts as nonverbal. So the next row down here, next part down the tree here, is I have some sort of examples, and I'm also going to change my pen color as we go along. Okay. For example, a positive verbal message could be like, "Hey, I enjoyed this," or "I had a good time." Yeah. Or um, bad verbal, down, negative verbal stuff that's like, ugh, that meeting is, or comments like, "What the heck is wrong with," things like that. Stuff we can't say on recordings. So when you get down to it, verbal can be broken down into observable events involving positive, you know, positive verbal things and negative verbal things. And this is the part you see as the interviewer. This is supposedly an eyeball. Okay. If you could see these things, you could denote them as positive or negative verbal comments and use them to help you figure out whether the person's happy or not. That's the power of the construct. By looking at observations and counting or identifying or describing things that aren't usually having numbers associated with them, you can work your way backwards up this tree to figure out what happiness is all about. Okay, now let's go grab a different color marker here so we don't go crazy. I will choose, I already used that one. Let's choose rainbow. What the heck? Let's see what rainbow looks like. Hey, that does not, okay, it is rainbow. Never mind. Okay, so let's go look at the nonverbal side. Okay, so if we're looking over here at the nonverbal side, it is kind of rainbowish. Okay. Okay, this is supposedly an eyeball. I know I'm not an artist. Feel free to critique me later. You're going to see all sorts of things: fidgeting, hand gestures, people playing with objects. I had one dude fold a paper airplane and start flying them during the interview, which was kind of interesting. Things like that. You're going to see things that you're going to note in your journal while giving the interview. And these will give you cues on the nonverbal component. You're going to get stuff like positive nonverbal cues, negative nonverbal cues, stressful nonverbal cues, happiness, questioning, whatever emotional state appears usually leaks out through their body language. And you can use that to help you figure out happiness. So by doing observations down here and then binning them into this row, you are able to figure out whether somebody is happy or not, even though happiness cannot be directly observed. Isn't that weird? If you think about it, the things you only directly observe are in the bottom row, but you use that to infer the stuff above it. This is called a construct. This is how you take something that's completely not measurable in any normal sense of the word of measurable and make it measurable. Why? How do we do this? Well, we told a story. We drew a little picture. We were like, cool, this picture allows us to tell a really wonky story on how to measure happiness. And once you have your picture figured out for your construct, whatever it is, write a paragraph about it. Now we're going to scroll up and I'm going to tell you the flow of the paragraph so you know what to do. Here we go. We're going to assume that you have some sort of diagram. It doesn't have to be a hierarchical diagram like this. It can be a cartoon. It can be a bubble diagram. It could be a Powtoon. I don't care what it is. It can be anything as long as it gets you from observation to quote unquote measurement or capture of something ethereal that's not very measurable. We're good. Here's what needs to appear in the paragraph. You need to introduce the construct. Give it a name. Describe its parts and dimensions. Okay? If you remember, our construct name is happiness. Its dimensions are verbal and nonverbal. Explain how the parts and dimensions interact. When you get down to it, verbal and nonverbal stuff do interact. When people get really angry, their hand gestures and other motions match. Okay? We'll leave it at that. When they get really happy, same thing happens. Or if someone is lethargic and kind of like, meh, they're kind of sedate and they're neutral. So there is some sort of relationship between verbal and nonverbal here, and we can talk about that in our paragraph. Then we wrap up with the convincing part here. Explain how these interactions help you understand the research problem. Sit down and explain, to be perfectly honest, how this construct helps you tackle the problem that you want to tackle. And if you can't do that, you know you got the wrong construct. The other part is you may want to ask yourself, you want to write a little bit about this, but you also may want to think about this a little more. how the heck do I go about measuring these things or counting these things or recording these things somehow as to generate data to help me infer happiness? That's what this last line is about. So if you could somehow plug these bulleted things together into a nice solid paragraph about your construct, you'll be able to sit down and say, during the interview, when I look for happiness, I'm going to be looking for verbal and nonverbal stuff, and here are some examples. And this is how I understand it. You have suddenly taken something as ethereal and distant and unmeasurable and intangible and is completely sometimes incomprehensible as happiness and made it something that you can actually look for during your interviews. Then you told a little picture story of it. Then you wrote the paragraphs such that everyone else can understand it as well. Now, what do you produce for your writing? This part here is kind of up to you. At a minimum, you need to have the paragraph. Ideally, it's nice having the picture as a figure and the paragraph to go along with it, because sometimes, you know the old saying or adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it is. Sometimes having the picture to go along with the one paragraph really flushes out the construct nicely. Okay. So however you write this up is going to be up to you, but there are the pieces that you need to have. Here's an idea about it, a way of going about it. Does your picture need to be a tree or a diagram like this? No, it can be literally anything as long as it works. You know, that's sort of the trade-off when it comes to qualitative sort of stuff. You get to be a little bit artsy once in a while. And sometimes it can be a good thing. It can get you to capture that thing that you couldn't capture before. Sometimes it may lead you down a rabbit hole and you end up capturing the wrong thing. Okay? So be careful. Other advice? None, really. I just wanted to introduce you to some of the stuff you're going to be working on this week. Now, one question I had from someone last week was this: can I have a variable appear in my construct? Usually, no. When you get down to it, if you do an interview and you talk to somebody, very rarely do numbers pop out of the person. Okay? Sometimes they would. Maybe you talk to a scientist or an engineer. Maybe. Okay? You might get some sort of quantitative data. But for average people who are not scientists and engineers, speaking as an ex-scientist, I used to be a theoretical physicist, numbers usually don't pop up during conversation. You know, it's not the most appealing of conversation topics. There's a whole pile of numbers. People just look at you kind of funny and say, yeah, we'll talk later. So in general, no, you really don't want to have variables appearing in your construct, okay? Can you have a construct appearing within your variable? Well, I hate to tell you this, guys. You quant people, this is the construct template, but for something with numbers. So the answer is kind of like yes. And this leads me to the last thought. Are these two things really all that different? No, not at all. If you sit back and look at both, you're going to realize they are two manifestations of the same thing. It is an attempt to measure what we observe, whether it's numeric, through language, whatever. It is simply a way to express a simple idea of this is how we observe something. This is how we break it down into parts so we can write it down and share it. Because if we didn't do it, can you imagine how hard it would be to share observation with anyone else? Observations would just be stuck within the self. Whatever I observe would be with me forever and lost once I'm gone. That's not what we want to do. We want to capture these things, somehow record them, and share them with the world. This is what these two apparently different things do. So when you get down to it, they're really the same. With that, a little too much philosophy. My apologies, and welcome to week 5. I'll see you later.